Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Rob Fowler, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan, and Brian Calley is my co-host. This briefing is brought to you by Marana Group. You can find out more about this data, documents, and distribution solutions company at maranagroup.com. It's Thursday, August 5th, and a lot of things going on, Brian. Let's start with sort of vaccines. I think that's been a big topic. You have been a part of the Vaccine Commission, one of the co-chairs of that group, and just kind of some progress that's being made. We've seen July numbers; they seem to be up, and while it continues to be a challenge, some progress.
Yeah, we are seeing some progress. So there's been a lot of advocacy work. The state had a sweepstakes that, when the state launched that sweepstakes, we were really hitting a real low, and it was really this summer lull that you would normally see on all types of vaccination. So it's not unusual for July to be that low point. But what we did see start to happen after hitting that low point the last week in June, first week in July, that it started inching up, and so it ended up finishing the month 4 weeks of progressive increases in the number of people choosing to take that first shot. We do like to see that, as that it's just protection against the use of epidemic emergency powers in the future, and so that has continued this slow climb up. We also see around the country that states that have faster rises in infection, and especially hospital overcrowding and fatalities, deaths associated with COVID-19, that they see their vaccination rates rising faster. And so in that case, fear of the virus itself is a motivator, but then we also see kind of inching up, and it kind of makes sense that it would be that June and July would be low points for Michigan. If you think about your, everybody watching, think about your summer and what you did with your summer. And are you likely to take a couple of days out of the nicest part of living in Michigan to both go out and get the shot, and then, maybe have some symptoms for a few days and not feel as well? And I think it's a tougher hill to climb in the summertime, but it does seem to be that trend has moved, and hopefully get us closer to that point where, when we hit this higher risk point in the fall, when the weather turns, that perhaps we'll have better overall inoculation, and again, more. Even though the state is not saying that they're going to pursue any closure orders in the future, or put on additional requirements by state order or regulations, that we know that that's always a tool that they've used it in the past. They could use it in the future. And so far, we're not seeing any kind of indication that they're intending to do that, close our businesses. But if we can keep especially the hospitalization numbers, actually, let me kind of dovetail that into one thing that's not really on our agenda, but we do forecasting. And we've looked at cases, positivity percentages. I think throughout a lot of the pandemic, I told you that that leading indicators of positivity percentage, and that's what I'm most concerned about. It leads to all the other things. But now with vaccinations, I think the most important measure that we can look at are overall vaccination rates of the population, respecting it's a personal choice, but hopefully getting to a point where we have herd immunity, but also hospitalizations. So vaccinations and hospitalizations, I think those are the two main items that, when it comes to the state using orders to impose regulations, put restrictions on gatherings or restrictions on certain types of business activities, as long as hospitalizations stay low, and there's still some kind of forward progress being made on vaccines, that we won't see those types of actions. And if you might recall, we had a pretty big wave in the spring, and at that point, the governor kept on pointing to, hey, look, a lot of people are getting vaccinations right now, so this will be short-lived. And so that tells me that that's one of the things that this administration looks at in making decisions about restrictions and closures.
Well, I don't think anybody who's a regular listener would be surprised to know that we are part of, the campaign, if you will, to get people who are willing to get vaccinated to do so because of the interest of small business. And, the Delta variant is spreading in Michigan. Average of 905 new cases from this past week, up from 377 the week before. 32 counties now are high or substantial transmission of COVID-19, up from 10 the week before. So it's not Data Monday, but there's certainly a lot of stuff going on. That's why we pay attention to this. You had an opportunity yesterday to actually help give the awards for the sweepstake winners. And you made some interesting comments just about how it actually is harder every week, every month to watch these numbers grow.
That's right. So, in the beginning, the main thing was logistics. We talked a lot about simplify the eligibility for vaccines and make the logistical system work much more smoothly. But then it went from that to now dealing with a more hesitant population. So you got some people are just kind of philosophically opposed to the concept of vaccines. I think we need to kind of set that population aside and just respect that's their choice. But when it comes to those that maybe just want to wait a little bit longer, or they're confused because they've heard a lot of mixed messaging on safety and other issues, that's a population that every single week, when another cohort of people, like last week, 41,000 people got their first vaccine shot. So that group of people is now in the column of having received their first vaccination. The remaining population is that much harder, that much more hesitant and difficult to reach. And so that means there'll be diminishing returns on the efforts, but it is still worth it. And that was a main message carrying forward. I've heard some people take issue with some of the efforts that the state is undergoing. I think there have been problems with some of the messages that, whether they intended it that way or not, that many of the messages have been received as condescending and or kind of finger wagging, or people have questions and they're treated like they shouldn't have those questions, or how could you not know the answer to this? And so the approach we're taking is different, like respecting, first of all, it is your personal decision. Second of all, the vaccine, though, is safe. We want you, when you make that decision, we want you to have the facts. No spin, no political agenda, just here are the facts. And to really use trusted partners in order to do that. And that means going outside of the regular government structure. There's a lot of people that just, they're frustrated with the government. They don't think that they've been consistent enough. It's sending a lot of mixed messages. I've been pretty frustrated with them too. So to really kind of go outside of that institutional structure and reach into more trusted local voices in order to deliver that message of it is your personal decision. We just wanted to make sure that you're making that decision based on the facts. And if you have questions, let's talk about those questions and do so in a non-judgmental way, in a way that puts aside all the political shenanigans that have happened with COVID-19 and just get right at the heart of the issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things that people have listed as something that gives them hesitation is that neither of the three vaccinations being used in Michigan are approved by the FDA. We're hearing that the FDA is going to speed up the approval. And do you expect that to be a barrier that will be down and some people will feel more comfortable?
Yeah, and let me just kind of qualify that a bit. I mean, the FDA did emergency approval, and then they do kind of a final regular approval. And they have everything that they need to do the final regular approval. They have for a while. It's just the bureaucratic process that's slowing it down now. There is some talk now that they're aiming to get that final full approval of the Pfizer vaccine by Labor Day. And so that will be I think that will be kind of a landmark step, a thing that, for those people that were looking at it and saying, you know what, this is done just under emergency approval, it's not full approval, therefore I just want to wait, see how it goes, and then make a decision later on. So that could be an event once the FDA does that final emergency approval or a final regular approval beyond the current emergency approval. Then just one more piece of data, one more piece of evidence where a person might say, okay, now I'm ready. I'm ready to go. And then I think the context of the fall. I mean, people in Michigan and our part of the country, we're used to the fall being a more risky time for communicable disease in the first place for any kind. And so, the idea of cold and flu season coming up, that I think between that, the FDA approval, some messaging that really gets at, tries to move beyond the judgmental type of approach. I think all these things coming together could make a difference in hitting some milestones. And again, just protecting our members that much more from the possibility of future closures, restrictions, and costly regulations.
Well, one of the things we always try to do is watch what's going on across the country. Sometimes that's a harbinger of things to come. New York City is now requiring vaccines to eat in a restaurant, go into a public place. The state of New York has had what some people are calling a vaccine passport, or at least the vehicle for a vaccine passport. And let me throw in Israel too, because it's another place that we've been watching. You've been talking about as maybe best in class, and there's some concern that they might be moving backwards.
Yeah. So let's start with New York. New York City has imposed what I think is like a true vaccine passport type of a system. So the state had an app where it would, you'd register on the app, it would tap into the state's database, verify that you had a vaccine, then you could like show it to enter places. But the state itself didn't impose regulations that required anybody to use the app, just that it's available. But the city of New York has taken now the step of an actual requirement that you have to be vaccinated to participate in certain indoor activities. And they just recently said, except for kids who aren't eligible. So in other words, kids could still do things. It is not clear, and they're apparently going to announce this later on, but there are federal exceptions to vaccine mandates, people that have certain conditions or disabilities, and also a religious exemption. How they're going to deal with that is not at all clear. And but what I'm most, it's not that I'm worried they're going to do that here in Michigan. I don't think that that's going to happen here. An individual organization might say that. They might say, hey, this is my business, or this is my organization, and therefore, here are my rules. Individual organizations might do that. As a government or state imposed vaccine passport, I don't think that will happen here. I hope that it doesn't happen here. What I'm worried for, though, and like for businesses in this type of situation, though, is that like literally the government's saying that if somebody doesn't have a vaccine, you have to turn away the business. If they have the type of business where it's an indoor offering, and so that's when I think about those businesses in that area, and what the small businesses that what they've had to go through, and now to say, hey, 30% of the population you're legally not allowed to serve, at least unless you can figure out a way to do it outside. That's a big step. Now in Israel, there's been a big change at the leadership, right? They have a new prime minister. The new prime minister was pretty critical of the old prime minister, or the previous prime minister, in terms of the approach taken. So their politics is alive and well in every country. So we tend to look at it like our country is really divided. Everybody else is is kind of like a certain singular way. So I think as the Delta variant has presented new risks and some reinfection activity in Israel, that the new prime minister has something to prove, doesn't want to underperform the performance before, so has reimposed some mask mandates and some vaccine requirements on certain gatherings, and also some pretty heavy travel restrictions. So that's a pretty big step back as well, considering that it wasn't too long ago when Israel was the country that was kind of giving the world a glimpse of the post-pandemic era. So kind of disheartening to see them in particular take a step back, because they have had such high success, relatively speaking, with respect to vaccines, but still feeling that they needed to reimpose certain types of restrictions. And doing so, not, here are their recommendations. These are mandates and requirements.
Yeah, that's again, the reason we watch for these places is because it could potentially be coming here, and we're doing all we can from an advocacy standpoint to make certain that doesn't happen. So I think a lot of people are concerned about schools this fall. According to the Michigan Association of School Boards, they expect every school in our state to be open this fall in person. That was as a result of some surveying they did among their members. And this week, some new guidance came out about schools and masking in particular, and other preventive measures that schools should be taking.
So the new guidelines for schools, and they're presented as guidelines. Those include universal masking, so that's the first thing, but also a distancing recommendation. But it's 3 feet. So I'm trying to imagine, classroom where I suppose there are certain types of tables when kids are really little where they may be closer than 3 feet together, but some distancing and masking for schools. I think you'll see schools generally follow CDC. Actually, public institutions generally will follow CDC guidance, and the substantial or high spread risk is, it's about 90% of the country right now. In the next few months, as things change and weather changes and our normal types of patterns, I think that's going to be pretty much everywhere. But schools do seem to be much more committed to in-person education than they have been in the past, and that's a good sign, because the amount of interruption in education and the long-term detrimental impact it will have on kids and our economy at large because of that, we don't fully know, but it's going to be substantial, and limiting that to 1 year is going to be pretty important. There's one thing that we learned: there's a lot of types of work that can happen effectively remotely. For the vast majority of students, remote education does not work very well for them. So there's not a substitute, and the fact that schools are offering in person, I think, is a big improvement. And there's another reason, of course, why we care about that. It's our future workforce. It's part of strong and healthy communities. It's also necessary for people to predictably participate in the workforce, as they have consistent offerings of school available for their kids.
So you just mentioned sort of public institutions. Also earlier this week, we saw some private companies make some announcements about what they're going to be doing in the workplace. GM, Ford, McDonald's, and how they intend to go into the fall. Yeah,
so General Motors and Ford reinstituting the mask requirements, so the indoor work requiring masks on a universal basis. And then for McDonald's, though, is different, because McDonald's is a public-facing organization. So they, from what I understand, it's difficult to tell because they talked about states with high risk, but I think they're going to use the CDC map for counties that have substantial or high risk, and having that a requirement for going into a McDonald's, and so staff and customers. Now, most of their business has moved to drive-through. Drive-through for fast food has really gone up in a substantial way, but that's to see the kind of retail public-facing organizations move in that direction, I think is a sign of things, that the concern over what is kind of immediately upon us is at a higher level than what we've seen since the middle of last spring, and and I think that you will continue to see bigger companies that kind of have more institutional behavior that will make decisions that look more like what government institutions make. In terms of what happens further down with all different types of organizations of all different sizes, it will be it's fine for the bigger companies to do what they're doing, and I'm sure it makes a lot of sense for them to kind of take a one size fits all approach, because managing a big organization is hard to do on a case by case basis. One thing I've really come to appreciate about how small businesses operate in these times is that you got a workforce and everybody knows each other, and you just work stuff out. You understand about what the needs and the concerns are, and you don't need a government regulation saying here's how everything has to be, because you have a team, you manage that team as a business owner, and you work out the particulars, and so it'll be our goal throughout to maintain that autonomy to do it that way, so that essentially you can have the best shot at success and growing and even thriving, if that's on the table for this pandemic environment, as opposed to always looking over your shoulder for what's the next thing the government is going to do to my business.
Hey, Brian, could you explain this? It's almost new language we're using now, high or substantial. The CDC now is putting out a regularly updated map, essentially, of the country. And it looks like that's going to guide a lot of organizations and institutions about when masks are required or not.
Yeah, this is, it's a different type of approach than what we might, we think of in terms of, absolute cases and where they're at. What the CDC tends to be looking more now toward is what's the trajectory and the change. So are things going up and going up fast? Are they staying level, or are they going down? So you might be high but going down. You might be low but going up. You might be anywhere but staying level. It's not as simple as before, when it was like, well, what are the rates of change? Or what are the absolute case levels? And your risk is tied to that. It's more about the direction and the momentum that you're going. So they have 4 different categories, but the substantial and spread and high risk areas are the ones that trigger the increased recommendations, including universal masking regardless of vaccination status. Actually, let me talk about that for a minute too, because from a vaccine advocacy standpoint, that's really frustrating. The idea that the vaccine status doesn't matter with respect to masks. I think what it's not my job to defend the CDC and their recommendations, but I think the why behind that is because they just recognize that if saying there's a difference between vaccines and no vaccines is like saying there's no recommendation, because it's not like people are checking vaccine status. So if you say masks requiring, like in this case, but not with that case, then you're essentially going to kind of a universal no mask recommendation. So they see it as practical, that nobody's really going to check vaccine status. Therefore, if there's any masks, you got to have all of them. I look at it like, where are you going to put your eggs? Which basket are you going to put your eggs? And is it in the most immediate, let's try and just figure out how to get through this day? Or do you want to play long ball here and go for maintaining kind of the integrity, the message behind why it makes sense for people to get a vaccine if they're hesitant? If you got to do all the same things anyway, then what's the motivation if COVID-19 doesn't particularly scare you in the first place? So anyway, that's there's been kind of a shift in their philosophy in terms of what they tie their recommendations to. And I don't necessarily disagree with that philosophy either. I think momentum and velocity and direction of the spread is probably more important than wherever you're at in terms of absolutes in your case count. It's just that the recommendations, I think, really do undermine the message or the reasoning why a person would want to receive a vaccine in the first place.
All right, we on Monday we talked a little bit about the moratorium on evictions, residential evictions primarily for lack of payment of rent or and the reason we talked about it on Monday was because last Saturday that moratorium had run out. We knew that would create some disruption. I think the concern over that led the Biden administration to reinstate that eviction moratorium for another 60 days. And but this time it's connected to areas with high and substantial COVID spread. And high and substantial is a county by county standard. So some counties may literally have an extended eviction moratorium while others do not. Certainly in Michigan, there are 32 counties as we speak who are high or substantial. That leaves a number that are not. So just a little update on that eviction moratorium. I think what we know is it's just kicking the can down the road for what will be a real problem for landlords and property owners.
Yeah, this is going to be. I think that what happened here is they let it run out. The president said he was going to let it run out, and then they just realized that by waiting this long, it caused a big problem, and they weren't sure how they were going to deal with the ramifications of it letting it go that long. And so they made the unfortunate decision of just extending it out further, which is going to make the problem that much bigger. And it's one thing that my time in government has taught me for the 12 years I spent in public office is that problems aren't like fine wine. They don't get better with age. They get worse with age. And fixing them with by putting it off and thinking, well, we'll figure it out later on. All the same conditions exist later on, except for the mountain that you got to climb got bigger. And the sooner that you can just face head on the ramifications of an eviction moratorium that lasted way beyond the original reasoning for it to go into place. That problem is here and upon this administration, upon the public policy makers. And I think they're really afraid to deal with those ramifications. And so the idea is just put it off a couple more months and see if we can think of something better. And I really don't know how you deal with how big this problem could be, and especially in certain areas of the country. So I'm disappointed. I was hopeful that they would be willing to just face head on in real time right now this tough challenge, but it's kicking the can down the road again.
Well, just as a reminder, the agency in Michigan that's given a responsibility for distributing the fairly substantial federal dollars is the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. And they have a program called the COVID Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or SARA. And if you're a landlord and you have tenants, or if you're a tenant in this situation, there is help available through the state, through MISHDA, and I would have you turn there. Let's do one more check-in. This is we've been talking about the Unemployment Insurance Agency and how they early on assumed eligibility for a group of companies that included, or of individuals that included sole proprietors and contract employees. And then there was a question about whether, almost a fight between the state and the federal government about whether they were eligible or not. The state has now sort of cleared up some of those eligibility questions for those who are caught in the middle of that.
And we have some members, some sole proprietors that took advantage, and instead of the Paycheck Protection Program, went into the unemployment system because it was better structured in their particular circumstances than the Paycheck Protection Program was, especially the first draw. So there were about 700,000, a little fewer than 700,000 claimants that had picked an eligibility criteria that the state gave them an option to pick. that the feds later on said you don't qualify under those circumstances. So they asked people to resubmit. So there were about 450,000 of those 700,000 that did not respond. 350,000 of those, the state had otherwise determined that they were eligible somehow, and so they've just decided not to pursue. However, if that group goes to reapply for unemployment, they're going to have to rectify the problem at that point again. So those people are no longer on unemployment. They didn't respond to the re-eligibility, and therefore, but they're okay. They won't have to pay it back. But if they reapply, then they'll have to deal with it then. The state's looking at the other 100,000 cases. I think there's going to be some duplicates in there. They also think that there's some cases where they're going to have to really dig in and understand what the situation is. And then of the 241,000 people who did respond to the Unemployment Insurance Agency letter, they'll be granted a waiver. I mean, basically, what the state has determined, and apparently the feds are okay with this, is that as long as you applied in good faith, then you're going to get a waiver even if you didn't qualify. And by responding to the inquiry, apparently that's your show of good faith. And so there's really no reason, if you ignored that before or you're worried about it, based on what they've done here, there's no reason not to respond to it. But there's I think there are a lot of people that were on unemployment before that probably won't be or have a lot smaller chance of it in the future. So maybe it'll be a non-issue across the board. But I think they're kind of at the tail end of dealing with what looked like it could have been a big problem, and maybe the federal waiver availability has allowed them to kind of move past it without having to deal with some of the ramifications that look like they might have to deal with before.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks for joining us today. I just want to remind you it is not too late to register for the SBAM golf outing. That is August 26th in Marshall, Michigan. The course is called the Medalist. It's owned by Lowell and Star Weaver, great members of SBAM and frequent watchers of this briefing, as a matter of fact. So shout out to them. Hope you can join us on August 26th for the SBAM golf outing. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back here next Monday. See you then.
See you on Monday, everybody.